Thanks very much, Paul, and thanks very much for Reed Corporate. Good afternoon, everyone here, and good evening, everyone on the East Coast. It's a pleasure to be here talking to you about the Antler project again. As the title to my presentation says, we are bringing the Antler copper project back into production. Antler was last in production in 1970. It's been dormant since then. We acquired the rights to the project in January. We completed due diligence in March, and we've been drilling essentially non-stop since then. Historically, Antler was mined to only within 150 metres of surface, and the grades of the ore coming from the mine averaged 5% copper equivalent. Now, over the last 6 to 9 months, we've been continuously drilling. We've now completed 26 holes at the project. We've announced results for the first 20 of them. Indeed, our most recent hole came from 450 metres below surface, and that hole intersected 23 metres at 6.7% copper equivalent. It's a phenomenal thickness, phenomenal grade, and this is continuous mineralisation coming from surface the whole way down to at least 450 metres depth, and the deeper we drill, the better the mineralisation gets. So when we say we're bringing this project back into production, it's not so much a case of is it going to come into production. To us now, it is a case of how big can this be and what scale production are we looking at. Just corporately, you can see a chart on the right-hand side of this slide that shows that over the last 6 months, we've been seeing gradual share price appreciation. And with that has come a continuous string of very positive results from this project. 20 holes announced to date, 19 of which have intersected massive sulphide mineralisation, and as I say, up to 23 metres thickness, and these results continue. We've currently got results pending for another 4 holes that are completed. We've got 3 holes in progress. We've got 2 rigs on site at present and a 3rd rig due there next week. So we're going hard at this because we're extremely confident that this will be mined. Our market cap has seen appreciation over that same period. We've currently got a market cap of around $55 million with about $3 million at bank. The Antler project itself is located down in northwestern Arizona, a Tier 1 jurisdiction. Fantastic infrastructure there. We're 20 kilometres from a railway, 20 kilometres from an interstate highway. Because there's an old mine there, there's a road right to the old headframe, and just 40 kilometres to the north of us, there's a town of 35,000 people. This is the old mine. That's the headframe at the old mine that was last operating in 1970. Why did we secure this project? We secured it initially because of the grade. The grade attracted us to it. So where they averaged 5% copper equivalent historic production, that makes everyone sit up and take notice. But has this got size potential? Well, it does. Historically, post-production in 1970, there was a phase of exploration drilling, all undertaken in 1975, and they drilled out a resource of 4.7 million tonnes at 3.5% copper equivalent. That's our base case, that's our starting point. So we know there's a lot more ore there, but there's a heap of exploration upside. And most of my presentation here will be discussing the exploration successes we've had over the last 6 months. But this is a VMS copper deposit. To date, we've just been exploring at the deposit itself, but this is a district. So there's 30 or 40 VMS deposits in the northern part of Arizona, where we are, including the biggest one of all, United Verde, where they mined 33 million tonnes of ore at almost 4.5% copper equivalent, and there still remains another 20 million tonnes of ore unmined at that deposit. So these deposits in northern Arizona can be very big. That's a 50 million tonne deposit. Earlier in this session, we've seen 200 and 300 million tonne VMS deposits. These can be very big. Equally, these VMS deposits occur in clusters. Where there's one, there's almost always more. And we know there's another one 4 kilometres to the north of us, and there's quite possibly more in the district. This jurisdiction, Arizona, could not be better for copper mining. The US is one of the largest consumers of copper, and 70% of the US's copper comes from Arizona. It is a pro-mining state. Where we are, we are in a sparsely populated, relatively dry portion of the state, and we are on privately owned land, which is really going to help us expedite mine permitting. And because of the grades, we're looking at a low capex proposition. The mineralisation comes to surface, so it's not going to take us a lot of money to get down into the ore to get mining underway. And because the grades are so high, we will be looking at a relatively small processing plant to process reasonably small tonnages to produce large quantities of copper. So what have we inherited here? What was done before New World came along? There was an incline shaft down from the head frame that we can see there, and the incline shaft was angled at about 60 degrees in the footwall of the deposit. The incline shaft was developed down to 200 metres below surface, and all of the historic mining came from the top 150 metres. Now, below that 150 metres, a panel of reserves had been drilled out in 1970 from a series of underground holes, and that's illustrated in the red ellipse on the cross-section here. So the underground holes drilled from the 7th level drilled out a panel of reserves that comprise 300 to 400,000 tonnes of high-grade ore immediately below the previous stopes. This was all drilled out in 1970 with a view to resuming mining, but mining never resumed. Post-1970, because of the decline in the copper price, this project went dormant. Then in 1975, the owner of the project drilled 9 holes from surface. These were very broadly spaced holes, up to 250 metres apart, but they were drilled over 500 metres of strike, down to 500 metres of depth, and 8 of those 9 holes intersected high-grade copper mineralisation. And as I mentioned, as a result of that, in 1975, as part of a feasibility study that was undertaken to assess the economics of recommencing mining operations, then a historic resource of 4.7 million tonnes at almost 3.5% copper equivalent was calculated. And that was it. Nothing else was done on the project. That's what we've inherited. So that's a cross-section. If I just flip that around sideways, so we now look at a long section to see what was done historically, then in dark grey there, we see the panel of high-grade resources reserves that have been drilled out from underground. The pink polygons is a historic stoping, and underneath that historic stoping is a panel of high-grade reserves. And then for the most part on the periphery of this slide, the B series of holes were the widely spaced holes drilled from surface. So there were 9 B series holes, B9, B4, B1, B2, B6, B7 as we go clockwise around the outside of this diagram, all of which intersected high-grade mineralisation. Sorry, all except one. Now those holes were very broadly spaced, but what those holes told us is that this is part of a very large system. Now, based on that wide-spaced drilling and based on the knowledge there was very high-grade mineralisation directly up dip from the deepest holes on the left-hand side there, then the results from 3 of those holes on the left-hand side showed that mineralisation might be slightly thicker there. So the intersection in B3 was 7.6 metres thick. The intersection in B2 was 4 metres followed by another 1.5 metres, and the intersection in B6 was 9 metres followed by another 1.2 metres. It was very sparse, broadly spaced information, but based on that information, to the best of our knowledge, we interpreted that there was potentially a thicker high-grade chute that plunged off to depth underneath the historic working. So we set about testing that. We completed due diligence in March, middle of March, and by the end of March we had a drill rig on site. The first thing we did was we drilled 6 holes, reasonably shallow, just to validate that the historic data was reliable. So the first 6 holes that we drilled were in the shallow portions of the deposit. They're illustrated in yellow circles here. So we'll use yellow and orange circles as I progress through these slides for our drilling, and the white boxes reflect the historic work. But the first 6 holes that we drilled were all shallow. I note the intersect in hole 6 that we drilled that's circled in the red polygon that was drilled 100 metres from surface, 20 metres from the shaft, and we intersected 13 metres at 3.5% copper and 5 zinc. That proved to us that there's considerable remnant ore in very close proximity to the existing underground infrastructure, and indeed in close proximity to surface. So essentially that first phase of 6 holes confirmed to us the veracity of the historic information. We saw in all holes massive sulphide mineralisation, in all holes very high grades, and indeed we were surprised by the thicknesses that we returned here because they were considerably thicker than the historic mineralisation that had been mined previously. Historically, they report that the stopes averaged 4 to 5 metres thickness. So in our hole 6, where we intersected 13 metres, we were very pleasantly surprised. So that gave us considerable confidence to start testing our interpretation that this thick mineralisation might extend deeper at depth, plunging off underneath the historic workings. So we turned our attention to systematically drilling deeper. And it may not be readily apparent on the slide here, but if you look at the slide in our hard copy that we've released to the market, you can follow the numbers of the holes as we progressively step down deeper and deeper. As I say, the yellow and the orange holes are our holes. And essentially we've sequentially been drilling deeper and deeper in that chute, consistently intersecting massive sulphide mineralisation. But not only consistently intersecting massive sulphide mineralisation, consistently intersecting extremely good thicknesses of mineralisation with the grade persisting to be very high grade. As I mentioned, the best intercept to date is 23 metres at 3.5 copper and 8.9 zinc. That's 450 metres below surface, and it's 300 metres below the historic workings. But the mineralisation is continuous down to these depths. The mineralisation is improving as we go deeper, and the mineralisation is open in all directions. It is open to the south, it is open to the north, and it is open at depth. And we continue to test deeper. You can see on this slide in orange, we've got hole 21 that is the deepest hole that we've drilled to date, and hole 21 has intersected 16 metres of massive sulphides, plus considerable additional mineralisation. So we're extremely confident that when we intersect massive sulphides, we can see it's very visual. I've got some core with me if anyone would like to have a look afterwards. But the mineralisation is very visual. When we hit massive sulphides, then we are hitting high-grade mineralisation. So it is a pretty safe bet that the results from hole 21 will be good. Subsequent to that, though, we've drilled hole 22. We've pre-collared hole 23 that we're currently putting a diamond tail on. We've drilled hole 24. We've pre-collared 25. We've drilled 26. And we're currently drilling 27. So there's a lot of information still to come. Now, what is the significance of this thick mineralisation? This is a very simplistic representation of a block of ore that may have dimensions of 100 metres high by 50 metres wide by 20 metres thick. And this is to scale. So that block of ore, the dimensions of that on the bottom of this slide are identical to the dimensions of the long section. A block of ore that size equates to roughly 400,000 tonnes of ore. From a mining perspective, we're probably looking at a mining operation that would extract 500 to 750,000 tonnes per annum. So a block of ore that size is half a year's production. And if I project that block of ore in the red polygon or the red rectangle onto the long section, you can see how much space that takes up. Very quickly, we are rapidly adding to the resource base here. And that's because of the thickness of the mineralisation. Historically, we expected that mineralisation might have been 4 to 5 metres thick. We are seeing zones where this averages 20 metres thickness. So we're getting 4 times the amount of tonnes for the same amount of drilling. What's the significance of that? The significance is the same amount of capital is required to develop across to that ore, but when it comes to operating there, you get operating efficiencies because you can have much larger scale mining operations underway that will extract those tonnes relatively quickly. So it is going to dramatically reduce operating costs. So we're rapidly adding to the resource base and rapidly reducing operating cost. Well, what about outside of that zone that we've been drilling? To date, that chute, that orange chute that is illustrated on that slide, has got a strike extent of about 200 metres. On the next slide, the 200 metres of strike is denoted with the blue polygon. So the blue polygon shows where that thick high-grade chute is, centred on the head frame at the Antler shaft, and I'll refer to that head frame in the next slide as well. Because the mineralogy of this deposit includes pyrrhotite, which is a magnetic mineral, in June we flew a detailed magnetic survey over the deposit. And unsurprisingly, we delineated a very strong magnetic anomaly directly over the top of the mineralisation that we'd been drilling. But more significantly, that anomaly, that magnetic anomaly that reflects the pyrrhotite in the mineralised system, in the ore body, that magnetic anomaly extends for 1,000 metres of strike. That is indicating that this is part of the mineralisation that we've been drilling to date is part of a much, much bigger system. Now, to go and pattern drill test 1,000 metres of strike when we know mineralisation goes down to 500 metres below surface would be a slow and expensive exercise. So having zoomed in on that 1,000 metres of strike, we thought this is a sulphide-rich deposit. Let's do IP, induced polarisation, over that system to see if we can define some areas where there might be thicker and or higher grade concentrations of sulphides along that 1,000 metres of strike. So during September, we undertook a IP survey with the results released in late October. And again, I just reference you to that black box that says the Antler head frame. Because if we look at the IP relative to the Antler head frame, we see that the strongest IP response is actually coming from immediately south of the Antler head frame. So it's actually indicating that the areas that we've been drilling to date at the northern end of the deposit may not necessarily be the best part of the deposit. So having got these results from the IP in October, then in the last week, we commenced drill testing the southern extensions of the deposit. And just yesterday, we announced the results from hole 26, which is the orange box in the centre of this slide, which is the same long section. Very first hole drilled to test that southern extension of the mineralisation. And we've reported that we've intersected 22 metres of mineralisation, which includes almost 8 metres of massive and semi-massive sulphides. So again, we're very confident that we've got very high grades in those massive sulphides, and the mineralisation around them is very strong as well. So we've now got the potential to expand the resource both along strike and at depth. So where are we going with this project? And I skipped a slide, but let's talk about where we're going with this project. Because of the near surface nature of the mineralisation, and because of the existing infrastructure and because of the high grades, we are viewing this as a near-term production opportunity. So we are pushing to apply for mine permits in the first half of next year. And while we apply for mine permits, we will be going through definitive feasibility studies. It's a very aggressive approach, but it is an approach that we are confident in because of the results that we've had to date and because of the scale potential of this project. So we don't even have a JORC compliant resource yet, but we are working towards that in the first quarter of 2021. That will feed into a pre-feasibility study. The mine design from that pre-feasibility study will be used to apply for mine permits, and we will continue to drill this deposit as we go through mine permitting and definitive feasibility study. So just to summarise on a timeline perspective, then we've been drilling since March, and we'll continue to drill through till the end of December, where the drillers are taking a 2-week break for Christmas and New Year, and then we'll resume drilling again. And we anticipate we'll be drilling through the most part of 2021. We'll receive assay results from that drilling campaign in January, early February. And we'll feed those results into a JORC-compliant resource, and we'll use that JORC-compliant resource to finalise a pre-feasibility study. And we anticipate on the back of that pre-feasibility study, we will be submitting mine permit applications and concurrently complete a definitive feasibility study and continue to expand the resource base. So a huge amount of news to come over the next months and over the next year. How big can this possibly be? I go back to United Verde, which is 150 kilometres to the east of us. There, up until 1975, they mined 33 million tonnes of ore from that VMS deposit, and there still remains 20 million tonnes of unmined ore there. So these deposits can be very, very big. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. Just alluding to your timetable there, given it's a brownfields deposit, how fast do you think you could be in production?
So our estimate at present for mine permitting is the order of 12 to 18 months. We are fine-tuning that, and we need to tighten those timelines up a little bit before we stipulate explicitly that is the lead time. But we are intending submitting mine permit applications first quarter of 2021 with a view to having mine permit approvals in mid-2022. So construction and into production 2023. That's very fast for any mining operation anywhere in the world.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Mike.